So last week I told you that I was recently at a conference in Bethlehem, Gospel in the Face of Religious Extremism. It was a fascinating conference because there were people from all over the world and all different traditions. In fact, the first morning I sat down to eat breakfast and a couple was there next to me and we began talking, and they were from England and they were Pentecostals. We had a great conversation, but then we left breakfast and went to the first speaker for the day, and it was an Anglican priest from Pakistan. It's so fascinating. They gathered there in Bethlehem, people of such diverse traditions and geographical regions gathered around the message of peace and hope. And throughout the week, we heard people from Philippines and Syria, the UK, the US, from Ghana, from Catholics and Orthodox and Messianic Jews and evangelicals all across the board. It was an amazing conference, and it showed me that the gospel really has gone throughout the world. God is working around the globe. It's an exciting time because you especially got to hear voices from the global south, different voices, and hearing new perspectives and hearing what God is doing in their midst. Now, a few weeks ago, I talked about the shift to the global south, and I mentioned the three major Christian traditions and the percentages of those populations. So I began talking about the Catholicism and how 50% of the world's Christians self-identify as Catholic. Now, as we talked about the shift over the last 100 years, we've seen something significant in the world of Catholicism. In 1910, 2/3 of all Catholics were in Europe. And now in the early 2000s, only 1/4 of the world's Catholics are in Europe. In fact, it's Latin America where most Catholics live today. There's been a significant shift in that direction. And you see this in the election of Pope Francis, the first non-European Pope. And so while there are still many Catholics in Europe and in the US, the three countries with the largest Catholic populations are Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines. And so as we look at Christianity around the world, we have to look at what's going on within Catholicism, because that's about 1 billion people. Now, some of those are surely nominal Catholics, but a good portion of the Catholics around the world are living out their faith and are great examples of following Jesus. I mean, just over the last century, thinking of people like Mother Teresa, Dorothy Day, Oscar Romero. Now, many of you are familiar with Catholicism, but you may not be as familiar with the Orthodox Church, the second tradition within Christianity I want to talk about. In the world today, about 12% of the world's Christians self-identify as Orthodox. Now, when people do surveys of Christianity and they look at the Orthodox Church, they bring 3 different branches together under the heading of Orthodox. The one we're most familiar with is usually called the Eastern Orthodox Church. These are the churches that you see in places like Greece and Russia and other places in Eastern Europe. In fact, the majority of Orthodox Christians are in Russia today. And the Orthodox Church even has a presence here in the U.S. We have a church down the street from Highlands, St. Luke Orthodox Church, which is an Eastern Orthodox church under the Patriarchate of Antioch. The second branch of the Orthodox Church I want to mention is the Oriental Orthodox Church. These churches have roots all the way back to the Apostolic Age. They split off from the Eastern Orthodox Church in the 4th and 5th century over a controversy about the nature of Christ. And they spread in places like Egypt and Ethiopia and even further east into places like Armenia. In fact, today, 94% of Armenia call themselves Oriental Orthodox. But the largest population of Oriental Orthodox Christians is in Ethiopia. The church in Ethiopia has been around for almost 2,000 years, and today has over 25 million people. There are more Oriental Orthodox Christians in Ethiopia than Methodists in all the U.S. The third branch is much smaller. They're usually called the Church of the East. And this also came out of those controversies in the 4th and 5th century. These are Christians that went east primarily into places like Iran and India and all the way into China. And for centuries, the Church of the East flourished, especially under Muslim control. But today, those numbers are way down. And so you do have small populations in places like Iraq. And even some have come here to the U.S. And so when we look at these three branches underneath the umbrella of Orthodox Church, it's important to realize that when we're looking at the persecuted church in the Middle East right now, in places like Syria and Iraq, that a good number of them are Orthodox Christians, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and even Church of the East. And finally, Protestants. 37% of the world's Christians are Protestants. And Protestantism is truly global because it is spread throughout all different continents. In fact, the 4 countries with the most Protestants are on 4 different continents. You have the United States, Brazil, Nigeria, and China. But over the last 100 years, where Protestantism has really grown is in sub-Saharan Africa. Lots of growth happening there. And across the board, from the Anglican Church, Lutherans, all the way to Baptists, Churches of Christ, all different groups, and even independent churches are flourishing there in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we could just focus on the 3 major traditions within Christianity and what they look like in the world today. But one of the most noteworthy trends going on in the world right now is a movement that happens across denominational lines, and that's the rise of Pentecostalism. Now, when people have done studies on this, like Gordon Conwell's University, they don't just look at people who adhere to Pentecostal denominations, but even people that call themselves charismatic. And so they use the term renewalist to talk about people who belong to Pentecostalism, but also those that are Catholics and Orthodox and belong to other Protestant denominations, but have many of the same characteristics as Pentecostals. This trend is remarkable because in 1970, there were around 62 million renewalists in the world. And if things continue like they are now, by 2020, over 700 million. The historian Philip Jenkins writes about this. Since there were only a handful of charismatics and Pentecostals in 1900 and several hundred million today, is it not reasonable to identify this as perhaps the most successful social movement of the past century? We cannot underestimate the importance of this movement in global Christianity today. And you see it especially in places like Latin America and places in Asia. One of the clearest examples is in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have a number of churches called African independent churches that have incorporated different practices from their culture, and thus their churches and their worship look really different than our own. Now, some of these churches that we might call renewalists are preaching health and wealth gospel and similar theologies, but a lot of them are living out their faith in vibrant ways and are making impact in their context. And we could learn a lot from them. And not just from them, but from other Christian traditions and churches throughout this world. We have a lot to learn when we look at the way people are living out their faith in their cultures, in their nations, in their contexts. The historian Justo Gonzalez says it this way: the fact is that the gospel is making headway among the many tribes, nations, and languages, that it is indeed making more headway among them than it is among the dominant cultures of the North Atlantic. The question is not whether there will be a multicultural church. Rather, the question is whether those who have become so accustomed to seeing the gospel expressed only or primarily in terms of those dominant cultures will be able to participate in the life of the multicultural church that is already a reality. And this is what led to the 4th initiative of the Restore the World vision: restoring the world by restoring Highland. This initiative is focused on equipping Highland members to be global Christians, because we can learn a lot from our brothers and sisters around the world, especially those in the global south and in different traditions, as they live out their faith in their context. And as we look at our other initiatives, we can look to churches in those places and follow their lead. We could learn a lot from our Orthodox brothers and sisters and other Christians living in places like Egypt and Nigeria as they work to be peacemakers and agents of reconciliation among their Muslim neighbors. Or even in our own context, as there's an increase in atheism and agnosticism, a rise of the nones, as they say, in the U.S. Well, we could look at churches in places like England and France and see how they are living out their faith there and reaching people in a post-Christian society for Jesus. But this is not just about helping our mission efforts. Being aware of Christians around the world and learning from them and seeing their theology and their faith will shape our own faith as we live it out here in Abilene, Texas. And not just from around the world, but also the historical church. The missiologist Stephen Pardue writes this: "In learning what it means for Jesus to be Lord in other places, we often grasp the gospel more fully for ourselves and are more able to see the blind spots of our own locally embodied versions of Christianity. Learning from the church throughout the world, as well as through history, is an essential activity for Christians since we are a Catholic or universal church." And so, as we move deeper into the Restore the World vision, as we work in places like Brazil, Southeast Asia, and the Muslim majority world, we don't want this to just be about doing good works out there, but we also want God to shape us, to transform Highland to be more like Jesus. And one way we can do that is to learn from our brothers and sisters around the world. And so, as our brothers and sisters face persecution, as they live out their faith in the midst of poverty and great suffering, we can learn a lot from them. As they do their own theological reflection and gain new insights into God, into how to be the church, how to worship, how to follow Jesus, we can learn a lot from those new expressions of faith. And also to look back in history and to be anchored into the Christian tradition that's much bigger than us. We have great opportunity for our faith to grow as we look at the church throughout the world and learn from the ways in which they're living out their faith. And so as our brothers and sisters take up their crosses and follow Jesus, may we follow them.